You stand in a pavilion of silk and felt, 100 miles from any permanent city, surrounded by the most powerful men in the world. They are dressed in silk robes plundered from Chinese emperors, in furs taken from Russian princes, in gold beaten by Persian craftsmen. The air is thick with fermented mares, milk, and the smoke of mutton fat. Outside, a city of tens of thousands exists only in tents, a metropolis that will vanish in a week and reappear 200 miles away. This is the center of the largest contiguous empire in human history. And you are about to witness something that will not be written down, that will be whispered about only in the language of the conquered. Something that exists in the space between law and custom, between power and biology. Before we go further, if you're fascinated by the hidden machinery of history, the systems that shaped civilizations in ways textbooks rarely mention, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. It's genuinely amazing to see this community of history lovers spanning every continent. All of us drawn to the uncomfortable truths that make the past real. Now, let's step back into that pavilion, because what you're witnessing isn't just a celebration of conquest. It's the performance of a system, one that transformed sexual politics into imperial infrastructure, that turned the very act of reproduction into a weapon of state, that built an empire not just on horses and arrows, but on wombs and bloodlines and the calculated erasure of entire peoples. We know the story they teach in schools. Genghis Khan, born Temujin, around 1162, in the harsh steppes of Mongolia, rose from poverty and tribal warfare to unite the fractious Mongol clans. By 1206, he was proclaimed Khagan, universal ruler, at a great assembly on the banks of the Onan River. Over the next 2 decades, his armies would shatter the Jin dynasty in northern China, obliterate the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia, and push west into Russia and Eastern Europe. By the time of his death in 1227, his empire stretched from Korea to the Caspian Sea, encompassing more territory than the Romans ever dreamed of. We see statues in modern Mongolia celebrating him as a founding father. We read analyses of his military innovations, his use of intelligence networks, his tactical brilliance. But there is another history, one that exists in the margins of chronicles written by Persian administrators, in the observations of terrified European monks sent as envoys in a secret Mongol text called the Yik Mongol Ulus, the secret history of the Mongols compiled in the decades after his death and hidden from outsiders for centuries. These sources reveal something textbooks rarely examine in depth: the sexual politics of empire. How did the Mongols manage conquered populations numbering in the tens of millions, with an original tribal base of perhaps a few 100,000 warriors? How did they ensure loyalty across vast distances before modern communication? How did they transform captured women from dozens of distinct ethnic groups into the mothers of the next generation of Mongol aristocracy? The answer lies in a set of practices that were simultaneously brutal and sophisticated, informal yet rigidly enforced. They were not written as formal law in most cases. They were simply the way power worked. The Persian historian Otomalik Juvayni, who served in the Mongol court of Persia in the 1250s, documented what he saw with a mixture of fascination and horror. The Franciscan friar, Giovanni da Pien del Carpini, sent by Pope Innocent IV in 1245, returned to Europe with accounts that seemed almost unbelievable. Rashid al-Din, the great Persian vizier and historian of the Ilkhanate, compiled genealogies and customs in his Jami al-Tawarik, the compendium of chronicles, in the early 1300s, giving us the most detailed picture of Mongol court life. From these sources emerges a system, a machine built from human lives. The scale was staggering from the very beginning. When Temujin was still consolidating power among the Mongol tribes, he faced enemies who had wounded him personally. The Tatars, a rival confederation, had poisoned his father Yazuge when Temujin was only 9 years old, leaving his family destitute and vulnerable on the unforgiving steppe. This was not a grievance he would forget. By Lingar, Temujin had grown powerful enough to corner the Tatar armies in battle. He did not simply defeat them, he issued an order that would become a template for Mongol expansion. Every Tatar male whose head reached above the linchpin of a cartwheel, roughly 3 feet or 90 centimeters, approximately the height of a 5-year-old boy, was to be executed immediately. The secret history of the Mongols records this command with chilling brevity. Thousands of men and boys were lined up next to cartwheels and measured. Those who were too tall died. The Tatar people, as a distinct ethnic and political entity, ceased to exist within a single generation. But the women did not die. The women were distributed among Temujin's officers and warriors. Temujin himself took 2 aristocratic Tatar sisters, Yasugin and Yasui, into his household as wives. This was not mercy, this was absorption. The Tatar bloodline would continue, but only through Mongol fathers. The children born to Tatar women would be Mongols, raised in Mongol camps, speaking the Mongol language, loyal to the Mongol Khan. Identity itself was being weaponized, the pattern repeated with mechanical precision. The Merkits, the tribe that had once kidnapped Temujin's own wife Bert in a raid, retaliation for an earlier offense, were crushed in Yarling Sith. Temujin took the Merket chief's wife, a woman named Qualin, renowned for her beauty. He would later give her to his son Gedai. The Karaite Confederation, former allies turned rivals, fell in 1203 from their aristocracy. Temujin took a young woman named Sorgatani Beki, niece of the Karat ruler, and married her to his youngest son Tolui. This single act of strategic marriage would reshape world history. Sorgatani Beki was brilliant, politically astute, and deeply ambitious for her sons. She would give birth to 4 boys, Mungay, Kublai, Hulagu, and Arik Beke. All 4 would become great Khans, or founders of Khanates. Kublai would conquer the southern Song dynasty and establish the Yuan dynasty in China, ruling over the most populous empire on earth. Hulagu would destroy the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad in 1258, ending 5 centuries of Islamic rule, and establish the Ilkhanate in Persia. Mungay would rule the entire Mongol Empire at its territorial peak. All of this sprang from a single woman, a prize of war, absorbed into the Mongol system. By the time Genghis Khan was proclaimed universal ruler in 1206, this practice was not exceptional. It was doctrine. Conquer a people, execute the adult males, or reduce them to servitude, absorb the women, especially those of high status, into Mongol households. The children of these unions became Mongol nobility. Within 2 or 3 generations, the conquered people's distinct identity was erased. Their genetic legacy folded into the expanding Mongol aristocracy. This was not random violence. This was demographic engineering on a scale that would not be seen again until the 20th century. They could not look away, those women standing in lines after a battle, watching their fathers and brothers measured against cartwheels or herded toward execution grounds, knowing they would be divided like livestock among the victors. The machine required rules. Genghis Khan understood that an army fueled by plunder and unchecked violence would eventually consume itself. Disputes over women could fracture alliances. uncontrolled sexual competition could destroy unit cohesion. So, alongside his military innovations, he imposed the yesa, a code of laws that governed everything from battlefield conduct to daily life. The yesa was never a single written document available to the public. It was a collection of decrees and customary laws, known primarily to the Khan and his inner circle, but enforced with absolute and terrifying consistency. The penalty for adultery, for any man or woman, regardless of rank, was death. There was no trial in the modern sense, no appeals process. If a married woman was found with a man who was not her husband, both were executed. If a man approached another man's wife with sexual intent, even if the act was not consummated, the penalty could still be death. This was not about morality in a religious sense. The Mongols practiced a shamanistic form of Tengrism, worshipping the eternal blue sky, and had little interest in sexual purity as a spiritual concept. This was about property and order. A woman, once married, belonged to her husband's household. To violate that was to steal, and theft disrupted the cohesion of the army and the tribe. Giovanni observed this law in action decades after Genghis Khan's death. He noted that, while Mongol nobles could have many wives and concubines, the sanctity of another man's claim was absolute. A soldier distracted by sexual jealousy was a soldier not focused on conquest. A camp torn apart by feuds over women was a camp that could not march 1,000 miles to destroy a kingdom. The yasa extended far beyond sexual conduct. The death penalty was also prescribed for desertion, for espionage, for homosexual acts, for urinating in a river or stream, for failing to help a fellow soldier retrieve a dropped item during a march. These were not arbitrary cruelties. Contaminated water could kill an army through dysentery faster than any enemy. A soldier who would not help his comrade was a fracture point in the chain of command. The yasa treated human behavior as a set of variables to be controlled with lethal precision. It was the operating system that allowed a relatively small population of steppe nomads to command multi-ethnic armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Every soldier knew that the rules applied to everyone, that even a prince could face execution for serious violations. The Mongol general Subutai, one of the greatest military commanders in history, once had to personally intercede to save a noble from execution for a yasa violation. The law was supreme, not lineage. This created a kind of brutal meritocracy. Obeyed the yasa, demonstrate loyalty and competence, and you could rise from nothing to command armies. Violate it, and you would die alone on the steppe, your body left for the vultures. They could not look away, those soldiers, watching a comrade executed for something as simple as washing his hands in a stream during a campaign. The lesson burned into their minds with absolute clarity. The conquered women flowed into a system that was vast, hierarchical, and ruthlessly organized. At the apex stood Genghis Khans for primary wives, each commanding her own orju, a term meaning camp or palace. These were not tents in the sense we might imagine. They were mobile cities unto themselves, sprawling complexes of hundreds of gers. The large felt tents of the steppe, surrounded by herds numbering in the tens of thousands, served by staffs of administrators, guards, servants, and artisans. The senior orju belonged to Burt Genghis Khan's first wife, the woman who had been with him since before his rise to power. Burt held a position of unassailable authority. Her sons Joki, Shagatai, Gadai, and Tolui were designated as the primary heirs to the empire. Despite persistent rumors, never confirmed, that Joki had been conceived during Burt's captivity by the Merkits. Genghis Khan publicly recognized all four as his legitimate sons. Bert's Ordu was the first in precedence. Behind her came three more great orders, each led by a wife taken after major conquests. Quailan of the Merkits commanded the second, Yasugan and Yasui, the Tatar sisters, commanded the third and fourth. Rashid al-Din documented the structure of these households in meticulous detail. Each Ordu was granted its own territories, its own subject peoples, and its own revenue streams. They were economically self-sufficient and politically powerful in their own right. Below these four great queens were dozens of lesser wives, women of noble birth from various conquered peoples, each with her own smaller household. And below them, hundreds of concubines, often organized into groups of 30 or 40, managed by senior women in the household. By the end of his life, estimates from Persian and Chinese sources suggest Genghis Khan had somewhere between 500 and 1,000 women in his various households. Managing this required a bureaucracy. Literate scribes, captured from the sophisticated urban civilizations of China and Persia, were brought into the ordis to keep records, manage resources, and educate the children. Eunuchs, taken as captives, or sometimes volunteers seeking the relative safety of court service, served as guards and intermediaries in the women's quarters, trusted because they posed no sexual threat. The ordis were the wombs of the empire. Every son born to a wife or recognized concubine was a potential prince, a future general, a governor of a conquered province. Every daughter was a strategic asset to be married off to loyal generals or client kings, binding them to the Mongol royal house. The women themselves were not passive. Bert was known to advise Genghis Khan on matters of state. Sorgatani Beki, wife of Tolui, would become one of the most powerful women in world history, effectively ruling large portions of the empire as regent for her sons, and maneuvering them into positions of supreme power. The Ordu system transformed the spoils of war into the infrastructure of dynasty. They could not look away, the scholars and envoys from sedentary civilizations arriving at these mobile courts and trying to comprehend the scale. The thousands of people, the immense wealth, all moving across the steppe in perfect organization. Commanded by women who had once been the daughters and wives of the Mongols' greatest enemies, then there was the practice that shocked outsiders more than almost any other aspect of Mongol culture: levirate marriage. When a Mongol man died, his wives, excluding only his biological mother, became part of his estate, to be inherited by his sons or brothers. This was an ancient custom of the steppe peoples, but the Mongols practiced it on an imperial scale. Giovanni da Pian del Carpini, the Franciscan friar, documented this with barely concealed revulsion. He reported that a son could, and often did, take his father's widows, his stepmothers, as his own wives. A younger brother could inherit his older brother's widows. The only absolute prohibition was against a man marrying his own biological mother. Everything else was permissible. When Genghis Khan died in August 1227, his designated heir, Gedai, became the third great Khan. Gedai inherited the imperial title, the armies, the treasuries, and a significant portion of his father's junior wives and concubines. This was not considered incestuous or immoral by Mongol standards. It was practical. A high-ranking woman came with her own retinue, her own property, her own political connections. If she were allowed to leave the family, all of that wealth and influence would go with her, potentially to a rival clan. Levirate marriage ensured that resources stayed within the patrilineal family. It was a closed economic loop. Gedai himself took several of his father's women into his household. When Gedai died in 1241, his son Giyak inherited his father's wives. When Tolui Genghis Khan's youngest son died young, his widow, Sorgatani Beki, did not remarry, which was unusual and a testament to her immense personal power, but her sons inherited their father's other women and properties. The practice continued for generations. Hulagu, when he conquered Persia and established the Ilkhanate, brought this custom with him. The sources describe levirate marriages being performed in the Mongol courts of China, Persia, and the Golden Horde in Russia well into the 14th century. It was a system that treated women explicitly as assets. They were valuable, to be sure. A woman of royal blood was precious, but she was precious in the way a warhorse or a skilled artisan was precious, a resource to be managed, deployed, and passed down to ensure the lineage never lost fraction of its accumulated power. They could not look away, the women. When a husband died and they waited to learn which of his sons or brothers would now claim them, their futures decided by men who might have been children when they first entered the household. The Mongol invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire in 1219 unleashed a calculated system of terror that reshaped Central Asia. The cities of Bukhara, Samarkand, Nishapur, Herat, and Merv, once centers of wealth and learning, became symbols of annihilation. When a city resisted and fell, the Mongols forced its population outside the walls and sorted them with precision. Artisans were taken for imperial service. Young women and children were seized for slavery and concubinage, and the remaining people were executed. Chroniclers like Juvayni and Ibn Alathir describe organized sexual violence committed publicly as psychological warfare, ensuring news of Mongol brutality spread ahead of their armies. The destruction of Nishapur and Merv became legendary, their reported death tolls exaggerated to convey totality. Irrigation systems collapsed, libraries burned, and entire populations vanished. Survivors carried memories of terror that persuaded other cities to surrender without resistance. Centuries later, the legacy of this system surfaced in genetics. A 2003 study revealed a white chromosome lineage found in about 8% of men across former Mongol territories, roughly 16 million people worldwide. The lineage traces back to a single ancestor in Mongolia around 1,000 years ago, almost certainly Genghis Khan or his immediate male relatives. Through practices such as levirate marriage and the absorption of women from conquered peoples, the Mongols created land empire and a demographic one. Their policies turned reproduction into a tool of power, still shaping populations long after the empire fragmented. Today, millions unknowingly carry a genetic echo of that era, a reminder of how deeply conquest can imprint itself on humanity's future.